So I teach at a university, and the first day of every new class, I disclose to my students that I'm disabled. And there's always a few before they catch themselves that I see that they crane their necks to see if they can spot my disability. And students look for my disability because they, like the rest of us, have been socialized to think of disability as some form of defect. In fact, there's a name for this kind of thinking. It's called the deficit framework of disability. In the deficit framework, anything that is seen as a variation from what's considered normal or typical is read as bad, a value judgment. So to be a person with a disability in this framework is to be a person who has something wrong with you, something broken, something defective. Now this is in contrast to the diversity framework of disability. In the diversity framework, we define something that's a variation from the typical, not as bad, but instead as natural. And diversity more broadly is seen as valuable. Recognizing the value judgments that are embedded in these categories highlights the fact that disability, like ability, is a socially constructed status, like race or gender. It's also for this reason that I do not identify as a person with a disability, but as a disabled person. Because according to the diversity framework, my non-typical ways of functioning are not automatically pathologized, not immediately read as something bad, nor as something good, but rather simply as different. You see, we define disability in this framework the same way the World Health Organization does, not as a defective attribute of an individual, but as something that is more contextual, more interactive. We define disability as a dynamic interaction between one's way of moving, of being, of thinking, and the built and social environment. Okay, the built and social environment. Let me give you an example. Let's take a person who has a non-typical way of moving about, say, a wheelchair user. A wheelchair user is not disabled as long as there are sidewalks and curb cuts, elevators, and ramps. But when that wheelchair user encounters a building, for example, with no elevator, no ramps, and only stairs, well, this is what it means to be disabled by the built environment. You see, a decision was made, probably a series of decisions made by a series of people who decided that wheelchair users are not as important, not as valuable as folks who can climb stairs. Well, as a stair climber myself, a deficit framework would describe someone like me as having a, quote, invisible disability. From a diversity framework, I describe myself as having a non-apparent difference in functioning, which I know is a mouthful, so many of us shorten that to talk about our non-apparent impairments. But it's this combination of invisibility and value judgment around disability that encourages many people like me to choose to pass. That is, to pretend to be non-disabled. Now, there's been a lot of research on passing, and probably the best known is that done by Canadian sociologist Irving Goffman. Goffman talked extensively about passing in his book called Stigma. And in that book, he wrote one sentence about a different kind of passing that he called covering. Covering is when, for example, you disclose that you're disabled, and then you never bring it up again. You never talk about it. Covering is minimizing or downplaying one's stigmatized identity. So I, like a true academic, have read about this, I've thought about this, and I found that Kenji Yoshino had written a whole book on covering, describing the ubiquitous pressure to downplay difference, to assimilate into mainstream culture. For Yoshino, this was the pressure to downplay his non-heterosexuality and his non-whiteness. So I have taken other people's very good ideas and I added a prefix, a whole new concept, one that I am calling uncovering. And I define uncovering as acknowledging, reminding people of, or just explicitly chatting about one's stigmatized difference. So when I disclose to my classes that I'm disabled, and then throughout the quarter, when relevant, I talk about my own experiences with barriers in the built and social environment, that's an example of uncovering. And I practice uncovering not just with my students, but with my collaborators and colleagues, my family, my friends. However, it has not always been this way. When I first started teaching, I felt very strongly that my personal identities had no place in the classroom, that they were irrelevant. Interestingly, I had exactly the opposite idea about research. In my research, I feel compelled to acknowledge and explicitly talk about my positionality, to talk about my whiteness, my gender, my disablement. Part of my training as a researcher was to learn how to be aware of and sensitive to the lenses through which I view a field site. But somehow I just didn't think that the same standard applied in my classroom. And then something happened. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to design a course on disability and human rights. And we were about halfway through the quarter, and as part of a discussion about the symbolic role of assistive devices, I took out my handy cane, which is just a collapsible cane that I carry in my bag for when I need it. And as part of my little show and tell, I necessarily disclosed. And my students reacted as if I had told them what I'd eaten for breakfast. I mean, really, nothing. No one blinked an eye, they just rolled with it, and I did not bring it up again. But then, at the end of the quarter, I got this flurry of emails and comments on my teaching evaluations that said, "You were the first disabled teacher I've had in college." And for the vast majority of them, the first disabled teacher they'd ever had, period. And students were reflective on this omission. One student wrote that the very lack of disabled teachers, disabled coaches, and other adults who had guided them through the education system really drove home the consequences of barriers in the social environment. That is, the degree of disability discrimination in our society that has historically kept disabled teachers out of their classrooms. This was a revelation for me. And the next time I taught that class, I disclosed right away, and I continued to talk about it throughout the quarter. And what I found was, the more I talked about it, the more they talked about it. The more students started sharing their own experiences with non-typical ways of functioning, talking about growing up with people who had some form of functional difference. Non-disabled students started asking more and deeper questions about these dynamics. And so while this was going on in my classrooms, at the same time I was doing my dissertation research with adults who've acquired non-apparent impairment through accident, injury, or chronic illness. And as I studied and analyzed my data, a very clear pattern emerged. Study participants who regularly talked about their impairments, who regularly shared with their friends experiences of moving differently, thinking differently, being different, well, they developed strong positive identities as disabled people. Whereas folks who routinely chose to pass as non-disabled, or disclosed and then minimized or didn't talk about their experiences, well, they internalized the negative stigma associated with disability. It turns out that uncovering, talking about impairment, not only familiarized the people around them with impairments more broadly, but it helped these individuals integrate new experiences into their everyday lives. It helped them normalize a new way of being, and it helped them regard that new way of being as different rather than shameful. So I had just published an article on some of this research. I was teaching a different class. We're about 2 weeks into the quarter, and a student, a disabled student, came to my office hours. She came into my office, she shut the door, and she started to cry. And eventually she told me, "So you do research? You teach at a fancy university? I just never thought I would see someone like me doing what you do. And then she said to me, so I'm here to talk about grad school. What's grad school all about? Right? And for me, that sealed the deal. Any ambiguity I felt about talking and discussing about my experiences with disability with my students evaporated in that moment. Because that, too, is the power of uncovering. So I want to leave you with this food for thought. Today, 20% of adult Americans, that's 1 in 5 people, identify as disabled. So if you happen to be privileged enough at this moment in time to function in ways that our society currently deems to be normal, and you think to yourself, wow, 20%, but I don't know any disabled people among my family or my friends or my colleagues, then I encourage you to ask yourself, what is it about you, the language you use, the jokes you laugh at, that might be perhaps inadvertently discouraging someone around you from uncovering? Thank you for your time.